Welcome, everyone. This is, as a voice of God said, this is a fishbowl. So that means everyone will be invited to join. We are here for this final session to explore how every single one of us have a part to play in building a resilient economy. And this is a very suited topic for Bellwether, the Bellwether Group, whose mission is really to bring more ambassadors, more people, more leaders, visionaries, communicators, artists to the climate and nature movement, and really to shape that sort of thriving future. Now, before we literally dive into the topic, no pun intended, I wanted to ask Mette Koban to say a few words of introduction. Mette Koban is the Deputy Mayor of London for the environment and energy and the environment. And Mette, it'd be great, I know you've been here before today, it'd be great to hear a bit your perspective on what it takes for every one of us to build that resilient economy.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to South by Southwest in the greatest city in the world, but also the city of Arsenal. Any Arsenal fans? We had a great weekend. I want to firstly start by saying how incredible is it that we've got this Nature and Climate House Summit right at the heart of South by Southwest. I think it's really important that we are really centering these conversations as we're thinking forward for what comes out of the week. And for me, it's really important because when we actually think about this topic about how we build resilient cities and economies, you know, you've only got to look at the cost of not building resilient economies. £281 million. That was the cost of the flash floods that took place in London in 2021. But behind that figure, putting aside the money for a second, there were thousands of properties across our city, basement properties, whose homes were flooded, so many memories that were erased for decades and they've lived through households. Irreplaceable cost beyond financial cost. 480,000 Londoners who currently are suffering with asthma through a crisis that they didn't cause in the first place. There are so many young black and brown kids across our city who will never ever be able to breathe the full capacity of their lungs because we've normalized breathing dirty air across our city. And now what we're seeing is there are millions of Londoners, working class Londoners, who are paying the price for us being dependent on fossil fuels. And every time something happens around the world, it's working class Londoners who are paying the price for higher energy prices. These are the costs of not building a resilient economy. It's the issue, as I always talk about, of social justice. It's an issue of racial justice, and it's an issue of economic justice. But it's also a huge opportunity for us to think about how do we redistribute wealth and tackle inequalities through the green transition. Because in many ways, the transition is happening. I mean, even if you take, for example, the energy industry, the transition to investing in more renewables across our industries in the UK, it is happening. And it's moving at pace. It needs to happen faster, but it is happening. But the question is, who benefits from it? Right? Who benefits from all of this transition that we're putting forward? And where we're stood today is actually quite an important case study for us. Shoreditch, you know, it's a very trendy and hipster place to live now, or to be. I say live, if you can afford to live there. But when I was growing up, honestly, if they offered you a property in Shoreditch, you'd say, no, thank you, mate, keep it. I don't want it. And one of the reasons why I got involved in politics very young, I was talking about this earlier, was I remember being brought up in Hackney, you know, the emergence of Tech City, which we have in Shoreditch, the creative industries, the Olympics on the east of the borough, next to Newham and Olympic Park. There was this real sense of excitement because there was loads of new opportunities, new job opportunities, new housing developments. But the question was for who? For who was it? Who was benefiting from it? And so what we're trying to do in London is really think about, when we are talking about the green transition, is thinking about how do we use that as an opportunity to really uplift every single Londoner. And on energy, that's one of the main reasons why we're heavily pushing community energy. Because not only we've got to deliver clean green energy, but it's also about how we democratize our energy system. How do we also use community energy as a way to build trust in our democracy? in a way where we can give our communities a real sense of ownership in their communities over their public assets, but also what we can do with the profits that are made from the energy and the excess energy that is made. Or when we take nature, for example, right? We talk a lot about adaptation. And we saw last week, we had extremely hot temperatures. I mean, I was in Saudi Arabia for Hajj. It was 47 degrees there. That's a whole different different level of adaptation that needs to happen in Mecca. But last year was the hottest year that we had on record in London and in the UK, actually. And again, if you think about the impact that has on workers in the workplace, you know, our elderly people, our population, young children, those with underlying health conditions, those having to take more time off work because they can't work in conditions like that, then the impact that has on our economy. There's a huge, massive implications and costs for us. So look, I think, you know, we're living in an extremely, extremely uncertain time in the world where we know there is a massive resistance against climate action. And we see that, you know, with a climate denier who's in charge of the most powerful country in the world. But I also feel a sense of optimism. I feel optimism because I meet people like Cal, for example, and so many other people in this room who are doing incredible work every single day in our city to help make sure that we can live in a much better city. And I think how we win hearts and minds is by delivering tangible benefits to Londoners that they can look, feel, and see. Yes, of course, we're doing all of this because we want to protect our planet for future generations. Of course we are. Otherwise, none of us will be here having this conversation. But it's also fundamentally about why wouldn't you want to be living in a city where you got nature thriving? We've spent centuries rewilding our city, disconnecting people from nature, the huge cost that has to people's physical and their mental well-being. We've spent centuries, again, you know, being dependent on fossil fuels and the impact that has on our air quality and the impact that has on people's ability to work. And so there is a massive opportunity when we think about London and the world that we live in. This isn't just about protecting our planet. It's like, let's be optimistic about the type of city. If I said to you, what type of city do you want to live in 2050? What is the type of city that we want to live in? And that's the question we've got to ask, right? And so for me, that comes from actually, going back to what I was saying about actually how I got involved in politics. Firstly, it's about centering people who are most impacted by it at the heart of that conversation. And that's why this is really important to have this conversation here in this format, in this summit here today. And that's why I'm really proud also that in the upcoming London Climate Action Week, young people through the second Youth Climate Summit that we'll be having, this isn't just a talk shop that we're doing, we'll be helping shape London's new climate action plan. Because they are the generation that are going to be impacted. They are the generation that is going to be impacted most by the climate crisis. And the least we can do as politicians is make sure that they have the agency to help deliver a fairer and greener London. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mete. You covered a lot of ground and a lot of very, very important and interesting points. So actually, I realize I haven't introduced myself, so I will be moderating this conversation. And my ask from all of you is to eventually not leave those chairs empty here at some stage. But I think you got already the idea. I'm Sophie Lambin. I'm the founder and CEO of Kite Insights. At Kite Insights, we are very preoccupied with the issue of how do we help organizations and people going through a profound transformation. We do that through research and insight. We have a debatable platform that creates a space for disagreeing agreeably. And last but not least, we have a platform called Herd that is a free learning tool for people who care about climate and sustainability and are looking away in that kind of intervention. So, the terms of resilient economy is usually described as an economy capable of adapting, recovering and from shocks and continuing to create value in the face of ongoing disruption. But what makes this conversation today, I think, particularly relevant is that resilience is not just about absorbing and responding to shock. It's really also about navigating transition, about creating the condition for what comes next, and from that also finding opportunities. Obviously, Mete talked about the the disruption, the extent and the level of disruption that we face, the transition is indeed already here. And while this transition, challenge our conception of the world and bring a lot of disruption, they also create opportunities to build stronger communities, more adaptive businesses, and ultimately more resilient economies. So the question I would like to put to our speakers today is not simply what we stand to lose if we fail to adapt. And again, Mette shared some striking numbers here, but what we stand to gain if we get the transition right. And while much attention is focused on where the transition is taking us, I think one of the real challenges that is interesting to talk about is how will we move through them? Because that transition has the power or the potential to exacerbate division, to divide us in a pretty dramatic way. And how do we go through this transition without creating more instability, more fear, more division? Now, is it better tech? Is it better infrastructure, better access to finance, better climate and nature solutions? Yes, of course, it is all of that. But does lasting resilience really truly begin with something maybe more fundamental, which is trust, social cohesion, and our collective capacity to navigate change together? So to help us explore this question and others, I'm delighted to be joined by my speakers inside this fishbowl. To my left, I have Tolula Oni, who is a clinical professor at the University of Cambridge and the founder of Urban Better. Please join me in welcoming. To her left, I have Kip Koskei, who is a Director of Strategic Partnership and Policy at the Insurance Development Forum. And then to my right, I have Kalpana Arias, who is the founder of Play. Now, you'll notice we have two empty chairs here, and this is an invitation to any of you at any time to join the circle with a comment, with a question, with a reaction to what you heard. The only prerequisite is that once you've joined the circle, at some stage you're going to have to leave it again, not because we don't like you here, but just because we want to open it up to other people to also join it. There is open spaces for you to join at any point, so please don't be shy. We clearly cannot design a resilient economy with only experts, however much we love them. We need to bring a diversity of perspective, and that's why we are all here together. So I'm going to start with an easy one, and you can decide how you're going to pick this one up. You heard me say that, how do we transition without tearing ourselves apart? And maybe that's what I will send to you as a first softball question, is what enables a society to transform itself without tearing itself apart? And maybe Tolu, I'll start with you.
I want to pick up on a point that Mette raised around seeing transformation but asking for whom. Because similarly, when we're talking about societies transitioning, before we ask how we do that without tearing each other apart, the question we should be asking is transitioning for whom and to what? Who is shaping that conversation? Whose futures are being shaped? Who stands to benefit? Who could potentially be left out? So those questions around, right from the start of who's asking the questions and who's around the fishbowl, as it were, which is why it's great to have T-Space open. In the work that I have done, so I work at the nexus of health and climate in cities, predominantly in cities that are rapidly growing across Africa and the global south. One of the things that we see there is, particularly say in cities across Africa where you have a majority young demographic, and I love that, this is why I applauded when Mette was talking about the Youth Climate Action Fund. Because we're talking about futures, but often we're not talking about them in intergenerationally fair ways. And we're not talking about them, and the conversation is not being shaped by the people who stand to live the longest with the consequences of the actions being taken today. So unsurprisingly, when we talk about transforming systems, we tend to focus on, we simplify, right? Because we get overwhelmed with complexity. And often we're not equipped to process through complexity. So, you know, I'm a physician by background, and we're trained to say over 80% of factors that influence health lie outside of healthcare. What should we do about health? Healthcare. Why? Because healthcare is a sector, we understand there's a lot we can still do, but when you start talking about the intersectoral action that needs to happen, when you start talking about how transport needs to think about health in terms of walking and cycling infrastructure and air pollution, and then when our systems are not designed to enable that kind of systems approach, and so as a result, we tend to focus on the lowest hanging, that is often the simplest, quote unquote, and that is when the people shaping the conversation, that starts to seed division and starts to seed despair, because not only are you getting to the root cause of issues, but the people who need to be part of shaping that conversation are not part of it. And so in the work that I do, I say that, you know, urban, yes, I see how that's setting you up. We need urban transformation, but technical solutions do not transform systems. People do. But people only do that and engage when they believe in, they've envisaged a desired future, which was the point that Mette raised around it. And I'm surprised a lot of young people I work with, like you push back and you ask, well, what is the future you're fighting for? And you haven't actually had the space to think about and to envisage that. So how do you know if you're going the right direction? So how are we equipping with that kind of futures literacy to design those futures? So believing in the desired futures, having the agency and the skills to be part of shaping that, and the pathways to be part of decision making. And I'll use that to hand over to you, because as it happens, those 3 points, agency, belief, and pathways and skills, are actually components of hope. Hope not as a sentiment. Mette, you talked about being optimistic. I make a distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism as a sentiment and as a state of being. Hope as a practice that has to be intentional, that can be cultivated. If we look at the institutions, our decision-making processes, how are we cultivating the agency? How are we cultivating the skills? How are we making pathways to build the coalition so that people whose futures are being designed are part of shaping those? Because if we don't cultivate that, we seed despair.
Thank you. I mean, and that's such an amazing start. I'm glad I started with you. But also it links to what the previous panel was also talking about. People's inability to imagine the future is a major impediment to them contributing to it, so feeling they have the agency to be part of it, and drives helplessness. So, Cal, what is your view on, you know, how do we create a condition for societies to not tell themselves apart in that transition?
Yes, I guess a really short introduction for those of you who don't know me. So I'm Kalpana, and I run a social enterprise called Play. We work at the intersection of nature and technology, primarily focusing on mobilizing youth and youth-focused organizations in how do we actually imagine and create and build these greener, healthier, more flourishing, biodiverse futures. And so, like, the point that you raised is absolutely right. We are living through an imagination crisis, and that's part of the problem why we can't kind of push past this kind of glass ceiling when it comes to thinking about, like, creating a new economy or a more resilient economy. And it does start with people, but I will also caveat with saying that even though, you know, we need a mixture of climate and tech solutions, and we need people in those decision-making spaces holding truth to power and also cultivating and building and creating those futures together, I don't think we can also handle this situation without having technology on hand, because these solutions require scale. They require us to respond to the crisis with a sense of urgency. And we can respond to the crisis if we have both people and tech at the heart of it, but it can't be tech in the hands of few, it has to be tech at the hands of many. And so the work that we really focus on is actually how do we democratize design and how do we democratize technology, especially when it comes to urban cities. And I love that you brought up, like hope as action. I think imagination is also a route towards action. And one of my favorite quotes, I can't remember who said it, so I feel really bad about this now, but she often talks about how the greatest kind of act of oppression towards humanity right now is policing of our imaginations. And if you think about the world that we live in right now and the kind of technology that we have, it's been very much built by very few people. But the questions I like to ask is, what if we actually have technology that is available and is imaginative and can be built by, the imaginations of many? And we have those case studies and examples of what that looks like in different forms of society, from biotechnology to, creating actually like retrofitting cities and all of this. So it's actually completely possible. I think and I'd love to hear from you about this, because I think the issue that we actually get to is actually how do we fund these solutions and how do we fund this kind of democracy and pathway. I think as someone who does a lot of community organizing, I think one of the main issues that we come across is oftentimes people want to fund systems change. However, they forget that systems change is led by people. And so funding people and funding communities is much harder, and that's what we need to fund. That's what we need to actually create and cultivate a resilience for. And a lot of that does start with trust. Like, there's a lot of reparations that actually need to take place, but it has to come hand in hand with solutions, and it requires us to be flexible, and we can build on that flexibility when we kind of stand within that power of being able to kind of hold both dichotomies and polarities in hand.
Thank you, Kalpana, and thank you to you. You probably, unbeknown to you, you've joined the inner circle of the fishbowl. Yes. So actually, can I ask you to maybe take this seat for now? Yes, thank you so much. So that I'll explain what's the expectation of the inner circle. But actually, Nikki, you legit. Not quite now, but that's okay. That's okay. I'll let you stay into the circle for now. Sorry, this is a complicated format, but I'm trying to get it right. But thank you for those great points. And maybe, Kip, if I go to you, we often talk about the cost of resilience, and we often focus on what it takes to build it. What is the cost? Talking about creating the condition for people to believe that there's a future for them. What is the cost of pretending that we are resilient when we are not?
Great question, but if I can sort of turn it a bit around, yes. And sort of go to what was mentioned by Kalpana, and try to sort of make the linkages here. But firstly, I just want to start with Mette. Like, if we could have politicians who speak with such clarity, yes, such force, such leadership, I think that's the number one aspect that we need. Because if you look around the world, we're lacking leadership, and it's a policy, politicians. We just need political clarity in terms of how we engage with this topic, and how we speak as a community. Because right now there's everybody's just fading the way they want to do. So there is a policy sort of conversation that needs to be had.
So sorry, just to pick on your point, are you saying that kind of clarity of language is an invitation for everyone to feel that they can be part of that?
Exactly, yeah. And this is why I come in, and I'll explain a bit my role. So I work in the insurance side of things, so more finance sort of related, and I work with governments in emerging countries and cities in trying to build up their resilience. And one thing I'd sort of push back, Sophie, to you is sort of, when we talk about transition, I think we talk about transition like it's in the future, something that's going to happen in the future. And when we talk about resilience, people need to be resilient now. So there is this dichotomy of sort of looking at resilience and transition. I think there is a yearning, and this is when the politicians come in with an open clarity such as Mette. we need to meet them at where the people are coming out. We want to be resilient now. So when there is a flood happening in London, it's the same conversation that somebody is having the same conversation in Lagos about a flood. So they need that certainty. And I think that's one of the things that the policy and the politician sort of element need to sort of lead by. Then I'll go a bit into the numbers in terms of what you said in terms of what's the cost. I think we look at it from a cost perspective. Obviously, if I look at it from an insurance perspective, you're looking at economic costs. So if you look at, on average, since I think over the last 10 years, since 2015, we're seeing average annual cost of NatCat loss, natural catastrophe losses at that point, was around 50, 60 billion a year. And this is claims paid out by industry, mostly in developed countries, in America, Europe, and Asia, less so in Africa and Latin and Southeast Asia. But now, on average, since 2022, we're getting around 100 billion, 110 billion, and that's becoming average. So we've doubled. And what does that mean? It means markets will shift, people will stop doing what they were doing previously, farmers will not have the same plants that they were growing, government's budgets balloon, and ultimately people will die. And that's the thing that we're talking about. It's now, it's resilience now, it's a transition that we need to do it now. It's not for the future. Lastly, and I think this is the sad bit of things, so we can, and I say we, in the financial world, in what we look at in terms of what you can see from the climate perspective, we can predict 50% of what's going to happen in the future. So we can see there's going to be a drought in East Africa at some point over the next 5 years. We can't predict that. We can see hurricane season happening in Jamaica over the next 10, 15 years. But only 2% is prearranged. We only have
only
funding. 2% of funding is prearranged. So governments globally, multilateral institutions globally, they only prepare themselves for 2%. The rest is crossing the fingers and hoping nothing happens. So to have systems with lack of leadership, lack of clarity, sort of translates to lack of money in the system, lack of prearranged thinking, lack of prearranged financing. And that results in people dying, people losing livelihoods, and governments not functioning. So it's a multi-layered sort of issue, but just wanted to bring some of those numbers to bear.
Thank you, Kate. And maybe if I go to you, Tuli, and there is still an empty chair, by the way, if anyone wants to take it. You know, in this world that Kip paints, where basically the disruption we face are no longer unexpected, it becomes the norm. What does resilience look like?
Yeah. So I often say I have a problematic relationship with the word resilience. Often.
I'm glad you accepted the invitation.
I was like, okay, because there is something implicit about it being inevitable, like let's just see what we can do, right? But actually, as you said, Kip, so much is anticipatable. What we call surprises are sometimes not just anticipatable, but preventable. So I call this, the notion of preventable surprises is an important one to surface. And I don't mean preventable in the long kind of climate arc generations. I mean in a 5-year period. But because there is this disconnect, so when we talk about action for resilience and why there is inaction, in addition to the cost of inaction being hidden, there are 3 reasons why action doesn't happen. 1, cause and effect are separate, disconnected in time and or space, right? So when we have a pandemic where you have exposure to a virus and in 5 days you get sick, we know the cause, we know the effect, we know how to act. If we had an exposure that then resulted in something catastrophic happening in 2 weeks, if exposure in London resulted in something bad happening in 2 weeks in Leeds. We know it's happening, we know it's coming, it's as catastrophic as the other example, but that disconnect causes a stasis. The second is we can continue business as usual. When we can continue business as usual, we think we can afford to cross our fingers, right? And the third is consequences can be othered. When you can say, well, okay, yeah, I'm doing my bit, but we can other the consequences elsewhere. So you start to see how the complex societal issues that we face, cause and effect are not side by side. We can often go about business as usual until we can't in places. And we can always I'm doing my bit, but the consequences can be othered in a different sector, in a different environment. And so we then start to see resilience as waiting for something to happen and be prepared for that. But if we reframed our thinking to more proactive resilience, to say, what would it look like if we were designing economies where we build the literacy to anticipate, to imagine futures, right? And then actually act to prevent. What would that look like? And that is that cost of inaction that is often, so air pollution, and Meti mentioned this, the average city across the, globally, loses annually between 2 to 5% of its GDP on air pollution alone. So when we talk about not what we can afford and what we can't afford to do, we often don't actually measure what we are not doing. And the reason why is something like air pollution. Where is the air quality, where is the pollution coming from? We're losing it in premature lives lost, days of work sick. Where is that manifesting? In the healthcare sector. It's not the health, most of that is not coming from that sector, but you can't act as easily. So you have to start thinking about new forms of institutions, we have to lean into institutional experimentation. When I founded Urban Better, it was that idea of how can we experiment with what an institute looks like? What are the systems how can we build that connective tissue that equips, that democratizes knowledge creation? Technology is, we work with young people, they collect data on air pollution and walkability, they use sensors, they run, and they use that to advocate. So technology and data in the hands of people, in hands of people who are invested in those futures and who can then imagine the desired futures and who have the agency and the pathways to shape those futures is more of what we need to build that proactive resilience. But this is not bits and pieces of initiatives. This is, as you say, this is the investing in the communities, this is investing in different types of institutions that can, and investing in that civic infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's not just the hardware, but the social infrastructure is so critical.
This is great.
Yeah. So you mentioned trust. I want to mention trust.
Yes.
Trust is not just in the current institutions. If we think about, so when we walked into this room, there was a sign, the title has changed now, but there was a sign actually that said the session was called New Power. And I thought, actually, that's a better title, because there is a book by Tim Heyman, and there's a quote there that says, there makes a distinction between old power institutions and new power institutions. And often we're asking to build trust in old power institutions that are not designed for that. And he makes a distinction, he talks about old power institutions as treating power as a currency that is traded. So you hoard it, I hold the power so that I can give you the power, and then I decide when to bring you in, and then we expect to build trust that way. And by contrast, he talks about new power institutions treating power as a current that connects, which is a very different kind of institution, where trust is in the DNA, where collaboration is in DNA, where ecosystems and systems approaches is in the DNA, where you're not trying to retrofit different systems working together. And we're starting to see that kind of experimentation, the Futures Generation Act in Wales, Wellbeing Economies. We're starting to see these experimentations happening. We need to be talking about that. We need civil society type of experimentation. We're starting to see that. The key thing is, how do we learn from each other and how do we scale in ways that build that proactive resilience that's needed.
Well, this is very rich. Thank you so much. And I love this concept of proactive resilience and creating a mindset of experimentation. I know some people want to come in the circle. We will free a chair in a minute. But I'll go to you, maybe, Paul, who is a front row commentator for this fishbowl. Maybe, Paul, you can briefly introduce yourself. But it would be great if you can build up on Toulouse thinking as it applies to food, which is your area of expertise, and maybe react to what you heard, or maybe bring the question you carry.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm Paul Behrens. I'm a British Academy Global Professor at the University of Oxford. I work on food system transformations. And I really, just to pick up what you were saying there, the citizens' assemblies, I mean, the climate assembly, what this shows over and over again when you were asking about transition, how do we keep everybody on board through this transition? I think to a certain extent we don't have to keep everybody on board, and actually there's...
I was asking how we don't tear each other apart.
Tear each other apart, sorry. Yes, okay, no, that's right, yeah. How we don't tear each other apart. So I think partly it's going to where the warmth is. So for the Citizens' Assembly, for example, 108 people from across the country asked what we would like to do, have slow decision-making processes, and, what do you know, come out with really, really far-reaching policies that would be on where the politicians are at. Probably more than we need more, but like things like frequent flyer levies, banning SUVs, which stunned me. I was amazed that came out. Reductions in meat intake. And so it just goes to show that when you have this deliberative engagement, actually you start to see this come out. There's an awful lot of money that goes into pulling the wool over our eyes in terms of how much we think other people care about these issues. And I think this is, we call this in science a pluralistic ignorance. And actually, if you look at any particular issue or sort of environmental activity that we can make, usually we underestimate it by half. 20% to a half, depending on what the issue is. For example, people intending to vote reform, you would think would be very sort of anti-net zero, very anti... above 70% of people intending to vote reform either like or don't mind onshore wind turbines, the most difficult turbines to sort of consider. So what we're doing is we're underestimating one another, and so we're underestimating our ability to be courageous in every room when we talk about what we're facing. And I think, that sort of bottom-up correction of that, I think, is really important. So I was involved in the National Emergency Briefing, which is now screenings around the country. If you haven't already seen it, please check it out. It's a bottom-up effort to try and get people on board. So, onto the food issue. I mean, we're facing a strong El Nino in all likelihood, which is going to boost temperatures even more. Closure of the Strait of Hormuz, already probably 10% food price inflation as of a few months ago, and actually that's continuing. So, I guess what I would focus on is how do we address this food security and food resilience parts. I have my own, sorry.
No, I mean, I was just thinking to get back to the topic of how everyone can become a builder of that proactive resilience. What would be maybe your specific thoughts on how do we bring more people into that proactive resilience concept?
For food specifically?
Yes,
yeah. So for food specifically, I think it's about understanding the agency that we have as individuals and the agencies we have in communities, and why we take certain actions. So, for example, if I took a look at resilience, it's hard to maybe draw the dots of why we need to be eating more plants, for example. Now, eating more plants is one of the biggest things we can actually do for the environment and also for dealing with resilience. And the reason is because actually a lot of the calories going through the animals are wasted, and if we eat them directly, we can deal with a much smaller footprint of the system. And so it's understanding why is that so important? Why is that more important than, say, many of the other things we can do? Local production is really important, but it's not going to shift the dial compared to some of these other actions that we can take. And so it's getting the message out about that. As an individual, you are very close to the system in the food system. Your choices do matter. You vote 3 times a day on what you eat. And actually, your choices, the system responds when you make those changes.
There's a lot of power in the food.
You've got a lot of power as an individual. In fact, when I think about it, it's where we have some of the most leverage in our lives. I mean, we can't often control where our energy is coming from, or where the electrons are coming from on the wires, but we can control what we eat. Having said that, we need the systems to change because the options need to be there. It can't be down just to the individual, and we need this environmental change. So I think that's how we engage. And there's this thing in science called policy sequencing. We need policies to come in that are low threshold, easy to bring in, that allow the next policy, which is going to be even more important, to come along behind it. And the biggest one for resilience, for example, in this country, would be public procurement. We need to be feeding people in public institutions a healthy diet, and that healthy diet has more plants, and it has wildly important resilience outcomes to it. And so we should all be calling for that also in our own lives and also systemically.
And there's certainly lots of space for experimentation in the space of food.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and you're
times.
seeing pilots like Greener by Default in the NHS looking at bringing in more plant-rich diets, which is actually cheaper for us as well and cheaper for the NHS. NHS, serves sort of 10 to 15 million meals a day. So there's a huge leverage in changing the food environment that we live in. That's really important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you for joining the circle. If I can kindly ask you to vacate your seat so that someone else can come and use it. Nikki, I left you a little bit of time to hear the conversation because the idea is for you to react. You get a gist of what we're talking about. Do you want to come with a question or comment?
Thank you. So I'm Nikki O'Malley. I'm CEO of 30 by 30 UK, so working on the UK's pledge to secure 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030. So I'm coming at this from a nature lens primarily. So building on a lot of what I've heard here, quickly catching up with the conversation, there's a few points, but what I'm hearing is there's a couple of ways for me to address the resilience conversation from the risk perspective of what we're trying to prevent, but also from the positive angle as well. I think it's important to not forget that. So when we bake in resilience to a system, let's start to talk about the case studies and the examples of how that can make life better, rather than just preventing disaster. Because absolutely we must prevent disaster, but we must also try to show people that actually if you've got more trees on the street that you live on, for example, your property will be worth more. People are interested in that. That's fact. We've just been discussing that in the round table that I was running down the road. There's positive examples of how baking in resilience from a nature perspective can do good for people and planet. And I think it's important to not miss that piece. Was just one of the points I was going to make.
Great. It'd be great maybe to hear from you, Kalpana. Do you have example of opportunities emerging from resilience that you can share?
I do, yes, very excitingly. And I love that you brought up Citizens Assembly because, so one of the things I did mention is my kind of gateway drug, you could say, into nature and climate was through guerrilla gardening. So I started guerrilla gardening back in 2020, and I'm now a part of the Right to Grow movement. That is a nationwide campaign happening across the UK. And we're actually running the first London's Right to Grow Citizens Assembly on June 19th. So if you're in London, then please come and join us. And that's a direct example of, people, democracy in action, but also of the actual many solutions that are happening on the ground led by people. And there's a quote by Ron Finley, who's a really incredible guerrilla gardener based in LA, but he often says that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And with the Right to Grow, one of the many things that we try to do is show local councils and also our political leaders that if they won't hear us, if they don't make room for us, we will start building those futures by ourselves. We will collectively get organized and do the work. And that's what's been happening across England, but also across London, we've got 8 to 10 different boroughs that are part of the Right to Grow movement, and it's just growing exponentially past then. But I love that you mentioned nature, especially when we're talking about resilience economy. There is no economy without nature. And I think being able to realize that we need to move beyond this kind of financial understanding and infrastructure of what nature means to us as humans, even though that's super important, we need to actually come into this social cohesion with the more than human, with the natural world, and seeing how that can actually create a more resilient, more trustful social cohesion when it comes to our relationship with nature, but also the economy that we can live in. But one of the, I guess, just to kind of share, move it along as well to other groups, I think one of the things that is super important to act on is knowing that I think if we're to actually create a resilient future, we need to understand who hasn't been in the room, both from like a people's perspective, but also from a natural world, and just some case studies and examples of people who are already doing that from kind of an economic, financial lens. Faith in Nature, House of Hackney are already putting nature on their board and seeing how we can actually give a voice to nature when it comes to creating these healthier financial systems that benefit people and the planet, as you mentioned, Nikki.
Thank you. Nikki, thank you for joining us. The chair is empty. I'd love to pick up on, before I go to you, Steve, if you allow me, I'd love to pick up on this idea of, how does resilience, whether proactive resilience enough, doesn't become sort of the privilege of the few. We've talked about involving people in the design of it, but the reality is very few people have access to air conditioning, to a space where they can plant trees. Any thoughts on that? And Kit, maybe you, Kip, sorry, you can say a few words. Keep it very short, yes, because time is running out.
Okay, very shortly, I think from the positive side, and for picking up what Nikki has said to it, I think there's examples out there which are, even in the UK, I think when we look at risk and we look at resilience in general, I think it happens everywhere. The social contract that we have amongst ourselves, we all pay tax, we all use the NHS, that's a resilience measure, that's a social a risk pulling element. If you have a house in the UK, you're paying insurance premium for flood.
Exactly.
Not necessarily because you have flood risk, because somebody in the Lake District needs that flood risk. So this social contract's happening. This Flood Re, which is a big UK-started insurance company, publicly owned, is doing great work and actually making money for the UK government in managing flood risk and preventing risk at the same time. So we have these examples not only in the UK, but globally. We have this, I'd call them unusual partnerships of public-private sort of coming together and sort of making systems work. Similarly, we have risk pools coming up in the Caribbean, which are protecting Caribbean countries, in Africa looking at drought and other aspects, and in the Pacific, where what's called PICRIC, looking at hurricane season as well. So the examples are numerous. What we need to do now is sort of look at those systems changes and how you scale them, because we've seen that this element of the risks are too big for individuals, for governments, for communities to carry on their own. How do you bring them together in a cohesive way that doesn't, it's not a product that you're selling, it's a system that you're changing. So it doesn't leave anybody out, like the NHS. We take everybody together in that instance. Sorry.
Thanks.
I want to add to the point that Nikki made around framing it positively with protect it or lose it, right? Because we also often speak from a deficit perspective of what we need to do more of, but often we don't talk about, you have an area where there is already a lot of nature, and we don't say, we want to keep this. We go where it's already been lost. And then we come back to the place where it's like, 5 years ago we were fine here, but we didn't shout enough about wanting it. So we often have the anti-voices speaking very loudly, but with the pro voices, makes sense. It's like, why should I say I want to breathe clean air? It's obvious. But actually, you actually have to show that it's desired. One of the things that we've seen, we've also been using citizens' assemblies, and connecting it to building trust. During the Gen Z protests in Nairobi, we had simultaneously the same Gen Zs that were protesting and rightfully so, because they were being marginalized from decision making, they were shaping their futures. In the same space, they were, in the same time, they were also engaging with city officials and helping shape that city's Clean Air Action Plan. They organized the first ever youth citizens assembly on clean air. They were engaging with the deputy director on the environment. They were very constructive, engaging with him on one hand and then protesting on the other. So these things are not, and we frame it as if, young people. No, they understand that where they have the space and they're equipped to shape, and they feel like that they're bringing that legitimacy. The government is responding because they're seeing that actually they can be more courageous in their actions because they have this buy-in from this important cohort. We're actually seeing action happen. So they can hold this dissonance simultaneously. Similarly, in Lagos, we had young people collect data and activate a walking and cycling transport plan that was dormant for 8 years. And why was it dormant? No one was fighting it, but nobody apparently wanted it. until they collected data during the marathon, and after the marathon they showed that the air quality was better when the roads were closed. They collected data on walkability. Then they engaged where they found the transport policy, and they started engaging with the government like, oh, okay, so you guys are making a lot of noise and want, okay, come help us shape this. And they've actually, and we're now doing a 3-year project with them on extreme heat, preventing extreme heat exposure as part of walking and cycling infrastructure. So when you have that happening, you start to see futures that are desired being shaped by much more diverse voices.
Yeah.
When you give that space to surface what people actually want and give them the space to imagine that. And then my last point, years ago, I spoke to a chief resilience officer of a city. It was a city with extreme heat, flooding, etc. And I asked her, what is your biggest resilience risk? Because we were going to do some work together. And I thought she'd say extreme heat or, food insecurity, whatever. And she said, our biggest resilience risk is the disenfranchisement of young people. Because if we don't pay attention and they decide they've had enough, we're in trouble. And so whatever we want to do is not the what, it's the how.
Right.
That is so critical.
Great. Thank you. Steve, you've been very patient. Thank you for joining the circle.
Okay, if I have a minute, I'm Steve Ravenhind from PA Consulting, and one of the things I'm hearing a lot is there's incredible pockets of activity, but where's the orchestration? And I wanted to draw your attention to an organisation that I'm part of, which is the Centre for Whole Society Resilience, that you may know, but founded by one of my colleagues, Professor Caroline Field. I'm just going to slightly read out the ambitions of the organisation here. Very quickly, but whole society resilience means that everyone at every level of a system works together to build a thriving, adaptive and sustainable society. To achieve whole society resilience, we need to work across silos to connect and empower government, public, private, corporate organisations, academia and education, the voluntary sector and communities to rise to the future's challenge. So please do join that society, because the more people that can cluster around that and create the centre of gravity and the critical mass, I think the better it is for all of us.
Great. Well, thank you. One of the ideas was to bring concrete ways for every one of us to get involved. So thank you for that contribution, Steve. So we receive a time's up sign with some clarity from the room. So I'm going to have to close, but thank you so much for your contribution. I think I'm going to try to pick up some of the points that have really stood out for me. This idea, the challenge of the concept of resilience as being something that is that we have sort of passively wait to happen to us, and the new capacity we need to build of being much more proactive in our ability to anticipate and therefore ability to imagine that future that we can build. The need to think about the transition from one state to the other. We're already into that state, but I think the risks associated to that are great. And what you were saying earlier about giving people the sense of agency, the skills, the pathways, so that they have they're not stuck into that sense of helplessness. Then what you were talking about, resilience is not something we build for people, but we build with people. And how do we the work you're doing in that space, Cal, is amazing in creating the condition for people to build that sense of trust and cohesion, to be part of the design. And, I think one of the points as well is that resilience economy is not something waiting for us in the future. We are, in effect, building up every day in our choice in how we eat, and those, amongst other things, in how we travel, in the plants we grow in our gardens or not, or the gardens we're part of. This idea that is not something that we're waiting to happen, we are making those choices every day. I just want to thank you, everyone, for this conversation. I wish more of you were able to join the circle, but time is never long enough. But I hope you enjoyed this format. And thank you again.